We have all felt that nagging sense that no matter what we achieve, it is never quite enough. We chase a promotion, a new relationship, or a better lifestyle, only to find that the moment we reach the goal, the satisfaction evaporates, replaced by a new craving or a hollow sense of boredom. It is a universal human cycle that feels like running on a treadmill that never stops. Most of us try to ignore this feeling with optimism, but one man decided to stare directly into that void and tell us exactly why we feel this way. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in the city of Danzig, which was a prosperous trading center at the time. On the surface, he was born into a life of immense privilege. His father, Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer, was a successful merchant who wanted his son to be a man of the world, disciplined and practical. His mother, Johanna, was a woman of high society, ambitious and deeply involved in the intellectual and literary circles of the day. But behind the closed doors of their wealthy home, there was no emotional security. Schopenhauer grew up in a house defined by tension and a cold, emotional distance that would color his entire outlook on human connection. When he was still a young boy, the political landscape of Europe shifted, and Prussian control over Danzig forced the family to relocate. This was his first real lesson in the fragility of safety. He saw firsthand that individuals, no matter how wealthy, are often powerless against the massive, grinding forces of history. His father, determined to make Arthur a businessman, took him on long travels across Europe. While other children were shielded from the world, Schopenhauer was exposed to the raw reality of human existence. He saw the glittering wealth of the elite, but he also saw the crushing poverty, the cruelty of the streets, and the quiet suffering of ordinary people. He had little interest in the world of commerce his father loved. Arthur was introspective and sensitive, a boy who preferred solitary reflection to the fast-paced life of a merchant. The relationship with his father was a constant source of pressure, marked by expectations that Arthur simply could not meet. Then, in 1805, the tension reached a breaking point. His father died under circumstances that most believed to be suicide. This event shattered whatever sense of stability Arthur had left. It confirmed his deepest fear that life was fundamentally unstable and that a shadow of despair followed even the most successful men. After the funeral, Schopenhauer walked away from the business world forever. He turned to academia, starting with medicine before realizing that his true questions were about the nature of existence itself. As he dove into philosophy, his relationship with his mother completely fell apart. Johanna had become a famous writer and loved the spotlight as her literary salons. Arthur, however, was socially withdrawn and openly hated what he saw as the superficiality of the intellectual elite. Their arguments were legendary and bitter, eventually leading to a permanent break. He was a man who was now emotionally isolated within his own family, a theme that would repeat throughout his life. He became obsessed with the works of Plato and Immanuel Kant. He loved Kant's idea that the world we see is just a representation shaped by our minds, but he felt Kant stopped too early. Schopenhauer wanted to know what was behind the curtain. If the world we see is just an appearance, what is the actual reality? In 1818, he published his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation. His conclusion was radical and, for many, deeply disturbing. He argued that the fundamental reality of the universe isn't reason or God or progress. Instead, it is a blind, irrational, and endless force he called the will. To Schopenhauer, the will is like a hungry fire that never stops consuming. It expresses itself in the way a plant grows through concrete, the way an animal hunts, and most painfully, the way humans desire. We are all just manifestations of this will, driven by an endless cycle of striving. We want something, we suffer until we get it, and then, once we have it, we are either bored or we immediately start wanting something else. He famously said that life swings like a pendulum, back and forth between pain and boredom. This was the birth of his famous pessimism. He didn't see happiness as a positive state. To him, pleasure was just the temporary absence of pain, like the brief relief you feel when a toothache stops. But despite the depth and originality of these ideas, the world didn't care. At the time, German philosophy was dominated by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was the superstar of the university system, teaching an optimistic view that history was a rational process moving toward a glorious end. Schopenhauer despised him. He saw Hegel as a fraud who used complex language to hide the fact that he wasn't saying anything real. In a move of pure defiance, Schopenhauer got a job at the University of Berlin and intentionally scheduled his lectures at the exact same time as Hegel's. It was a disaster. Hundreds of students flocked to hear Hegel, while Schopenhauer sat in an empty room. Only a handful of people ever showed up. This public humiliation deepened his resentment toward the world. He eventually gave up on teaching entirely and withdrew into a solitary life in Frankfurt. For the next several decades, he lived alone with a succession of pet poodles, all named Atman. He followed a strict, repetitive routine, avoiding close relationships and keeping the world at a distance. He was known as a bitter, abrasive man who carried a hidden pistol and mistrusted everyone. Yet there was a strange tenderness beneath the armor. He was one of the first Western philosophers to argue passionately for the rights of animals. He saw them as fellow sufferers, driven by the same blind will, and he believed that our shared pain should lead to compassion. He didn't think we were completely trapped, though. He believed there were two ways to escape the cycle of the will, even if only for a moment. The first was art. When we look at a beautiful painting or listen to a great symphony, we stop wanting. For a few minutes, we are no longer a slave to our desires. We are just a pure observer. He believed music was the highest form of art because it didn't just describe the will, it felt like the will itself. The second estate was more difficult. It was the path of the ascetic. By practicing restraint, humility, and renunciation, a person could slowly quiet the will. He was deeply influenced by ancient Indian texts like the Upanishads and the teachings of the Buddha. He saw in Eastern philosophy a confirmation of his own belief that the only way to find peace was to stop wanting. For most of his life, Schopenhauer was a ghost in the philosophical world. He lived off his inheritance, walked his dog, and wrote books that nobody bought. He was convinced he was a genius, but the public neglect stung him every day. It wasn't until his final years, in the 1850s, that the mood of Europe began to change. People were getting tired of the empty promises of progress and the chaos of revolutions. They wanted someone who was honest about how hard life could be. Suddenly, Schopenhauer was famous. A younger generation found his honesty refreshing. They saw a man who wasn't trying to sell them a fairy tale. His influence began to spread like wildfire, touching the minds of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and Richard Wagner. He finally got the recognition he craved. But he didn't have much time to enjoy it. He died in 1860 at the age of 72. Arthur Schopenhauer's life was a mirror of his philosophy. He was isolated, critical, and deeply aware of the pain of existence. He didn't offer us a way to be happy in the traditional sense, and he didn't promise that everything happens for a reason. Instead, he offered something rarer: clarity. He challenged us to stop lying to ourselves about our desires and to respond to the suffering of the world not with denial, but with compassion and restraint. In a world that constantly tells us that more is better, his voice remains a haunting reminder that peace only comes when we finally learn to let go.